I have something really cool for you guys. About 15 years ago, I got my first gaming PC from Velocity Micro. I still have the spec sheet and the invoice, so let's see how big of a difference is there from a PC from back then to one to today. So let's get started. Hey guys, Tiago with Classical Technology. Thank you for joining me again for another video. Please subscribe if you enjoy my content, smash that like button, leave a comment below. Do you have a gaming PC that you got years ago, and how does it compare to your current one? I have something really cool to share with you guys. Recently, I came upon the spec sheet and invoice for my first gaming PC that I got 15 years ago. Now, I didn't build this one myself. This was the start of it. I got it from Velocity Micro, and it was about a $3,000 PC back then. I'm gonna go over the specs and look at the hardware and see what really has changed from back then till now. Obviously, all of the components are gonna be different, but are you still going to have the same type of components? Is it still going to be similar in terms of the power supply and the case? So let's see what kind of difference we can find. So first, let's start with the case. This is a Velocity Micro case. They're a boutique builder like Falcon Northwest and Main Gear. And I remember when I was choosing a gaming PC back then, I didn't want something that was a little bit generic, like maybe a Dell or something like that. So I decided to get it from Velocity Micro. They looked like they had some pretty good prices for their hardware. And in fact, they're still in business today. So let's talk about the case. The thing that we're going to notice here and compare to a modern case, it has a clear see-through panel. Now, it's not tempered glass. A more modern case likely would have tempered glass, but it was just like a plastic or acrylic. But I remember how awesome it was to be able to see my components. And it also had blue lighting inside, which was pretty awesome. It's not like the RGB we have today, but it lit up the PC and it looked absolutely awesome. That was one of my favorite things about it. So those are two things that it would have in common with a PC nowadays. So even 15 years ago, the market already wanted these sort of see-through cases, as well as some type of cool lighting inside. And while this case is proprietary, the Velocity Micro, you can't really buy it as a third party. It is a pretty standard case nonetheless. It was ATX. And like we said, we have the clear window. So it's something that you could easily replicate today. The next item on the list is going to be a 550 watt Antec power supply. Back then, for some reason, I remember Antec being a lot bigger than they are now, especially with cases and different components. This system wasn't necessarily the highest spec you could have gotten back then, but it still was a pretty high spec. So 550 watt power supply, I think it was more than enough. Moving on to the motherboard. Now, this is interesting. It's an Intel motherboard with a Zalman cooler. Now, back then, Intel made motherboards and they were considered some of the best. And I remember actually being really psyched about this motherboard at the time. And then the Zalman cooler is something kind of basic. Liquid cooling, of course, was around 15 years ago, but it was nowhere near as prevalent as it is today. AIOs weren't really that popular either. Now, the amount of RAM here is pretty interesting. 2 gigabytes of RAM. Back then, believe it or not, was more than enough for playing games. Even if you had 4 gigabytes of RAM, it's only recently that we jumped up to 8, and now I feel 16 gigabytes of RAM is really the sweet spot. A lot of games will take advantage of 16 gigabytes, so I don't really think that you want to go much lower than that, or else you may start to hamper your gaming performance a bit. But back then, 4 sticks of 512 megabyte RAM for 2 gigabytes was more than sufficient. And it was DDR2. That shows you how long ago this was, not even DDR3. DDR4 has been around for a few years as well. So that's pretty interesting. And of course, you're gonna have such a leapfrogging of technology from the second generation to the fourth that the RAM speeds are gonna be completely different. Before we get to the GPU, which is of course is always the saucy part, let's talk about the hard drives. This is actually pretty exciting. These are the WD Raptors. Back then, there were really no SSDs. These 10K Raptor drives were some of the fastest ones you can get at the time. I really needed that RAID 0 to get as much speed performance as possible. And looking back, this was definitely one of the smartest decisions, as I've learned through time that the hard drive is one of the best components you can upgrade on your PC, just to feel snappiness and feel that it's faster, especially in Windows. Of course, I had a backup drive here. I also had a CD and a DVD drive. That's something that's also not really apparent at all today. If you notice here, I also got a floppy disk drive. That's pretty crazy. I don't remember that. I don't remember even ever using it, to be honest. Now, let's talk about the GPU. This is going to be an EVGA NVIDIA 6800 GT. and it came with Battlefield 1942, which was one of my all-time favorite games. Like, I literally played that game so much on this computer. That was one of the primary purposes of me getting this computer, was to be able to play that game. So this Velocity Micro was really my first hardcore gaming computer. And now, this wasn't the most expensive GPU at the time. There was the Ultra. For the CPU, I had a Pentium 4 660 at 3.6 gigahertz. At the time, this was a pretty big deal. This was a pretty fast CPU. Once again, it wasn't the fastest CPU you could buy at the time. Intel always had their Extreme Edition, which really stands for extremely expensive. And while that one did perform tremendously well, it was out of my budget range, and I thought that this one really was a sweet spot. So I really enjoyed the CPU, never had any issues with it. As the months passed and time went on, I got more and more interested in computers, and I would want to upgrade different parts. The first thing that I actually upgraded, well, aside from fixing those lights I mentioned earlier, the light sticks had sort of come a little bit loose and I had to fix it. But the first thing that I upgraded was my sound card. And now, if you notice, this system did have a Sound Blaster Audigy 2 sound card. I really always loved sound for the gaming immersive experience as well as for music. Back then, sound cards were a lot bigger of a deal than they are now. Now, they're still good, of course, and there are a couple from Sound Blaster and EVGA that are fantastic, but most people will go with their motherboard onboard solution, or maybe like a USB DAC, or the USB DAC that's inside of their headset. And I remember actually upgrading it myself to it was like the Fatality Sound Blaster card. And over time, little by little, I would upgrade different things on the system, like the RAM and different components, the hard drive. So that's really how I got into PC building, is by seeing a system that's like this and then starting to tweak it and change different things and really be excited about upgrading hardware. So for this being my first gaming PC, I really loved it. It had pretty much the perfect balance of every component. It had a cool case that was clear, with lights inside. Of course, that's always the most important. Then performance is second, but RGB and aesthetics are first. But this gaming PC, looking back at it, had an absolutely awesome balance of price and performance. So I really like looking back at this PC, and it gave me a lot of good years of performance, as well as it sort of ignited the interest that I had to tweak PCs and build them. Eventually, I went on to build all the water cooling PCs that you see now and be really interested in it. But I thought I'd just share this PC with you guys. It was really my first gaming computer, 15 years ago, so I think that's pretty cool. All right, guys, thank you very much for watching. Subscribe if you like my content, smash that like button, leave a comment below. When did you get your first gaming PC? And I'll see you guys on the next video.